Welcome guys, gals and non-binary pals to this week's episode of Buffy Boys, your weekly review of Buffy the Vampire Slayer from a queer, literary and feminist perspective. My name is Joel, I'm one of your hosts, and with me as always is your other grieving host.
Brian, hi, how's it going?
Hi Brian.
The thing I was going to say there was, are you trying to do like a somber voice?
No, maybe not my usual hilarity, my balls to the wall level of high octane zany comedy, yeah?
Yeah.
Because of course this week on Buffy,
More like of
Boys,
corpse.
of corpse. We'll come back to that. The alternate title we've used for this episode is quite blunt, I think.
Yeah.
This week on Buffy Boys we were talking about season 5 episode 16 of Buffy, The Body.
Mm-hmm.
Which for if anyone wasn't previously aware, has been aware of our building dread approaching this episode, is the episode in which we examine Joyce Summers' death, and also widely I think acknowledged as one of probably the best episode of Buffy and one of the best episodes of television. So
yeah, I think other people would argue for I think the other argument for best episode of Buffy that people often make is Once More with Feeling, which I think is a stunning episode of TV and really, really immaculately structured, but like, for my money's worth, this beats Once More Feeling out of the park, like it knocks it out of the park every time. And I think there are better episodes of Buffy that are not like special, unusual episodes that are also better than Once More Feeling.
Yeah.
But
so to start off with, we're the bronze is closed for fumigation, no banter today.
Yeah.
Because we have a lot to talk about. So Brian, do you want to kick us off with a Buffy and summary?
Yeah, sure. Episode? 1 second. After a flashback to Joyce's last Christmas, Buffy calls an ambulance. Joyce is dead from a post-op aneurysm. Spelt wrong, I think. Anyway. The Scoobies meet up to join her and Giles and Dawn at the hospital. Willow has a clothes crisis and Anya broods about mortality. Dawn goes to the mortuary where a vampire attacks her. Buffy saves her. They look at their dead mother. That was the worst one yet.
Yeah.
A, it's a morgue. They say the word 800 times during the episode. B, like, you know, they look at their dead mother. Like, yeah.
The end.
If you're going to try to get into the individual moments of like, and try to give synopsis of those, you don't. Anyway, it's so confused. And also, other important information. This is season 5, episode 16, written and directed by Joss Whedon, and it was first released on February 27th, 2001. Yeah. So The Body, it's great.
It's notable and distinct from previous episodes we've covered in many ways, in that it is a stylistic, a thematic, and a structural break in the show. Very little nominally happens in the episode. It really just takes from Buffy finding Joyce dead to her being brought to the hospital, pronounced dead, and kind of her autopsy over the course of, I think it's portrayed as really just a few hours.
Yeah, and it's I felt that it kind of went a bit quicker than most Buffy episodes. I'm not sure if that's just because it was like, it is gripping TV, but it does feel like it has like it goes along the snappier pace because it is kind of bereft of turns and twists and stuff.
Yeah, and it's distinct in a couple of other ways. One is that there's no music in the episode. It's as we'll get into, there are
no establishing shots for the locations. There's no outside shots of the house. There's no shots of the hospital. And
although there is a kind of a nominal appearance of a vampire in the last scene, it's essentially an episode without any supernatural monster of the week type elements. It's entirely focused on the mortality of her mother dying and the incredibly human reaction to that.
Yeah, and we'll explore all this in detail, obviously. I think to start with, I think the episode's closest relation in the show has to be Restless. The kind of the dreamlike nature of Restless and the format breaking nature of that episode really, really gets replicated here. Even if you take Hush, I think Hush is incredible. I also think though it exists within the bounds of the Buffy universe. It feels like another episode. I think the only other close episode to these two in terms of the extreme structural break would have to be Superstar. But otherwise, like, you know, this and Restless are very much in their own track at this point.
I've often found that Hush is in some ways more similar to Once More Feeling, because it's a very stylized, balletic, music-driven kind of performance.
100%.
Whereas this is a stripping back of performance.
Yeah. So yeah, let's get into then the effects of the episode. So as you mentioned, there's no audio. There are no establishing shots. The cinematography throughout is very, very specific. There's a lot of situations where, say, Buffy is talking to people and she sees their mouth and nothing else, because she is so narrowed in on this thing, she can't really focus on anything else, and she's experiencing like trauma essentially.
Yeah, so I think actually to perhaps put a name or a specific focus on what we see is that when she realizes her mother is dying, her reaction to it, it's absolutely trauma. It's probably tremendous amount of panic, but I think more accurately a dissociation. She's incredibly dissociative through a lot of that, and her reactions, her pulling and dropping focus, and her almost childlike moment to moment, I have to make a call now, I have to go over here, is like very much, I think, in line with that kind of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, the one that always sticks with me for this episode is when the EMTs are leaving and she says good luck. That's just completely out of body. Like it's a situation where her ability to conduct social interactions has completely stripped from her, because she has no foundational level on which to create any social interactions, because the basis of her life to this point was Joyce, and relate that she doesn't have anything to really construct anything from. Other effects are things like the episode kind of exhibits a lot of what I would understand as free and direct discourse, which we've talked about in the podcast before, which is the kind of structure of where the structure of the text takes on the psychological realism of the character. So the best example of all time will always be in The Dead by James Joyce, which is the last story in his collection called Dubliners, which, if you're looking for an in with Joyce, I'm not going to be the first person to tell you this, but Dubliners is a great one.
It's pretty readable.
Yeah, and The Dead is probably the best short story ever written. So when the first opening line of the short story says, I can't remember the character's name, I think it's Kitty. Anyway, it says Kitty was literally run off her feet. And of course she wasn't literally run off her feet, because to be literally run off one's feet is, I'm not sure what that means.
Impossibility,
yeah. And what's happening there is that the narrative text is taking on some of her vocabulary and her understanding of things, or communicating what she might communicate without saying, I'm literally run off my feet, thought Kitty. So it's what you get in this episode is visual.
It's imbued.
Exactly. So the world becomes imbued with Buffy's perspective in this episode. So you see at one point you see she's looking at the telephone to call Giles, and the whole her gripping the telephone through the first act of the episode, and the episode is very much structured into 4 acts, and we'll discuss that a bit maybe. But the when she goes to call Giles, she looks at the phone, and the numbers are all like visually distorted, not visually distorted, but they're all magnified very slightly, so that they look surreal. And it's basically her trying to interpret these numbers, and she knows she wants to call someone, she doesn't understand how to.
The normality of it is undermined. It's that feeling of if something so fundamentally is being rendered, is what do I just press these buttons and then Giles comes, everything's normal when it's not.
Yeah. And it's making you look at something with a new base. She's looking at something and she's trying to interpret it with no ability to. It's fascinating, but so you get a lot of visual stuff like that. There's another very good moment later on in the episode where where she's talking to the mortician, who's actually, you pointed out, the doctor from the last couple of episodes, or the episodes where Joyce was in the hospital, and she asks him, they have a conversation. She asks him a second time, are you sure there wasn't any pain? And while his lips are moving, saying one thing, the audio says, I'll tell you anything I need to make you feel better, or I have to lie to you about this, basically. Actually, Rhonda Wilcox, who we will talk about extensively during this episode, because as I bring up every time we come to these episodes, she has an entire essay, an entire chapter written in her book, which is called The Art of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Why Buffy Matters, The Art of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But she devotes a whole chapter to this episode and looking in depth at this episode. So we'll refer to her loads. It's a really good structure. If anyone wants a photocopy of the essay, let me know. But it's great. So she highlights that actually specifically as being used in the pilot of 6 Feet Under, which is accurate. And actually that kind of like stylistic insanity is very exists a lot in 6 Feet Under. So you get a lot of like that kind of structure. And when you look at the other Scoobies, when they're in the dormitory and stuff, while there's a lot of like disassociation and loneliness and like visual kind of disconnection from each other, you don't get that kind of othering effect on the world. They don't, you get a lot of close-ups between like Willow and Tara, and then you get a lot of like, when Anya and Xander are in the car, there's no sound either outside or inside the car, and it's because they feel numb, which is a very different representation of their reaction to Buffy's reaction, which is panic and fear and extreme loneliness. Sorry, you were going to say there?
No, it's just like there's some interesting elements there where in terms of Buffy's reaction is such a full-bodied, a fully essential breakdown, a molecular level, and everything about the world starts to separate its bonds, and you see kind of even in that excruciatingly long opening scene,
and opening shot, like the opening shot where it's not in the Thanksgiving scene, where she's like going with the phone to see if she can find help outside and stuff, and she's called, like that's all one shot. It's really well done.
And she walks outside, and the way she's shot, the way Sarah Michelle Gellar's makeup is, she looks very sick and very like pale, and just like not makeup to be attractive, makeup to look like someone who has just gotten sick. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the light is massively overexposed, and she's hearing strange things or picking up on things she wouldn't otherwise. So I think that's carried through with the other characters insofar as that's the root radiating out, and it's what it portrays about the process of loss and the process of death, which is so rarely well portrayed in this way on television. Is it's not the dramatic, poetic tragedy of it. It's the moment to moment. What do we say? What do we do in the minutes in between the things happen? It's all well and good to be like, I have to do CPR now, but I think one of the most haunting things is like after the paramedics are like, well, we have to leave, and you need to wait with the body until the hospital comes. Maybe get a glass of water, and something that really like. The idea of like, okay, well, I'm just going to walk and get a glass of water and maybe watch a video on YouTube and sit in my kitchen because that's all I can do. Yeah. It's just so ineffable.
Yeah. I think for me, the moment that really stuck out, and this is the moment that sticks out for everyone about this episode, actually is something I want to talk about a lot or I think is really important about this episode, is that when I was doing my research, while Rhonda Wilcox writes extensively about it, and you can find extensive notes about it online and Wikipedia pages, very few academic essays I could find about it. It might just be that I don't have the right books or whatever. But and I think it's because the episode is very direct. There's, if your experience as a viewer isn't far off what an academic understanding can bring further goodness to, in the sense that like, I think there's some episodes of Buffy where we can sit down and we can like talk about it on the podcast and be like, oh, this was...
You have to pull it out, essentially.
You can pull it out and you can say like, oh, wasn't the imagery very smart here? Or look, this is reflected in the structure of this. There's some Freudian goodness here, etc. In this episode, I think one of the strengths of Buffy throughout the show is that the level that's delivered to the end user, the viewer, the average viewer, the impact on the average viewer of this episode is completely direct and is entirely on the surface. There's no, I mean, like, you know, if the effect of there being no sound made you feel really disoriented, sorry, no music made you feel really disoriented, then you're sitting there feeling disoriented, and you're experiencing the same thing that an academic at the other end experienced. They might be able to say, oh, that's because there was no sound, no music, but you probably figured it out yourself. Anyway.
Something which contributes to that accessibility for the viewer and the real sense of trying to portray a sensory experience is the way that I think they quite accurately portray the different kinds of reactions people can have in the various ways that people react throughout the episode, you know, in terms of as trite as it may seem, things like Willow obsessing over the appropriate thing to wear is obviously a representation of her feeling that she isn't mature enough to deal with something like this. Xander's, you know, characteristic kind of toxic issues, putting his fist through the wall. Giles generally being a bastion of support throughout this, but obviously in later episodes getting quite upset on his own time about it. You know? I think there's something in there that's relatable for anyone, really.
Yeah, no, for sure. Actually, I remembered what I was trying to say, which was that the moment that really stuck with me is in this watch through. I think it sticks with everyone. Is the moment where Buffy says to Giles when he comes in and he tries to help basically by potentially doing CPR or figuring out what's happening, but she says like we're not supposed to move the body, and there I think it's the most horrific reaction anyone has in this show at any point, because like Buffy's acknowledging or to herself or verbalizing that her mother is dead, and the othering that she experiences there at that point of replicating the words other people have said to her, and therefore made it real for herself that this is no longer her mother, it's a body, and it's a horrific and physical presence that is disgusting and terrifying. Yeah. And like she looks just like the most broken she ever does in this entire show, and Giles just holds her. It's very upsetting. Yeah,
there's a fear there that she has by saying that has made it true.
Yeah.
And obviously we have a death like this is tragic in any circumstance, but with our Vampire Slayer there's this aspect of death being her gift, and that you know, this is bringing the professional and the personal, I think, too close together for her.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about Buffy through the show is that she does feel the kind of the level of control that she can exercise and wants to exercise through the show over things like death specifically is possible, and bringing this completely natural, very upsetting death into her life is just the worst possible thing. You know, it's horrifying.
We also see, obviously, I think in that scene, part of the scene where she is performing the CPR, and just the whole thing is so upsettingly. Oh, that's like be clear that we cried through the whole episode.
Oh yeah.
But when she is quite childlike, it's like, no, I remember how to do this. I was taught how to do this. I can do this. You know, does the CPR, has that daydream or that imagining that somehow she's surviving, it's all right. That's interrupted by her cracking Joyce's rib.
Yeah.
Something which, you know,
happens.
Is very common in CPR by anyone, but there's obviously that inclement fear where it's like, is it because Buffy is too strong and that she's done this? You know, all of that I can feel bubbling, that sense of responsibility and guilt. Yeah, no, it's awful. Yeah, no, we did have a good old cry during this episode. I think there's a lot of different elements there. I think we're still sticking to the first opening act, and it's important to note, and every Wikipedia page ever will note that the 4 acts are all open with close-up shots of Joyce's face, dead face. Apparently, Christine Sutherland was a complete trooper throughout the filming of this, and they only had to edit out her blinking once, and they did it with CGI. Actually, one thing we noted about the episode, we probably should keep this for later, is that there's a ton of like cameramen just in the corners in the widescreen shots of it, because we were watching widescreen, and at one point it was just like you could see the entire camera around the lens, because they were using a wide angle lens on the shot of Xander and Anya driving. Exactly. So often when that, so basically you can see inside the lens whenever it's a actual establishing or an actual exterior shot. So in the past it's been when they've actually shot a location, sometimes you can see it, and this is obviously, it was mounted on the front of the car, so it was very Truman Show actually. It specifically looks very Truman Show.
So yeah, I think there's something that's important to note there as well about the as you noted, like, yeah, Buffy is shown as very pallid, very like distraught. While she's going to the back door to is after she's called Giles, but before he arrives, she goes towards the back door because she hears noise out there, and she just pukes on the carpet.
She must have a bag chicken fillet roll.
Yeah, she must have. And then when she's going towards back, one of the things that Ronna Wilcox specifically notes is that apparently when she goes to the window, she can hear some children playing. She can hear some wind chimes, and Ronna Wilcox says you can hear the ocean in the distance. It's never something I picked up. Maybe need to listen to it with headphones. But she notes specifically that's kind of like represents a lot of like just like life continuing on in a very disturbing and very unreal way while everything is supposed to stop in that kind of very odd and way. You know the poem
Stop All the Clocks.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That feeling of, which I think is relatable for a lot of people, that feeling of offense or wrongness, where you're looking at it's like, no, don't you know everything is over, and that how the things which are meant to be the most quotidian and pedestrian become the most it's almost like the world is commenting on your experience. Yeah.
And it's so one of the things that I think people noted a lot about this episode is the fact that Buffy just like she's gone from being this kind of like hyper glam, very, and like it's so funny. I was reading just a lot of the commentary around this episode, and apparently people really took really noted that like Sarah Michelle Gellar, this Maybelline cover girl. Actually, no, not cover girl, probably, but this Maybelline representative and just beautiful model like woman was portrayed so unglamorously and so sickly and so shocked. And when she's sitting in the hospital, her hair is greasy, her clothes are on kind of sitting wrong, like her neck lines off and stuff like this, and she looks like she might have she looks like she might be sticky to touch. It was kind of gross. But and it's so funny because like a lot of people noted that about this. They're like, oh my god, they finally did this. Like, Buffy is, she's usually so girly and stuff, and it's so funny because these days people being portrayed as girly or glamorous or feminine is not a note against their feminist abilities, not abilities, or feminist
capacity or representation, or
exactly, like that's just like that's no longer an issue. You wouldn't say oh, that woman wears makeup, so maybe she's not a good feminist representation these days. That's not how it works, which is great. But there's a lot of very interesting feminist touches to this episode where you are daring to portray a young woman who's not glamorous because she's experiencing something horrible, and the interactions between people. Like there's this episode absolutely fails the reverse Bechdel test. There's no interactions between two men. I think Xander and Giles hug at one point, but otherwise they don't actually they certainly aren't talking about anything but Joyce, and then the interactions between Tara and Willow are just wonderful. Very important to note as well, on our Queer Buffy the Vampire Slayer podcast, that this is the episode where Willow and Tara kiss for the first time on screen. Probably have already kissed in person, off screen, and it's lovely. It's one of my favorite writing notes of Buffy is in season 4 you have a lot of the relationship being explained through this kind of metaphor of magic and magical orgasms and stuff, and then in this season they've crept in, they've used the word gay a couple of times, and there's been a lot of understanding of them as a couple, and then finally portraying that the kiss, which I'm sure if you're a lesbian viewer of this in 2001, you're really excited for at the point at which they might actually kiss, and it coming along in a not very special episode in not in a very special episode, or where that's the point of the episode, or even that's going to be the most talked about thing about the episode at all, is a moment of genuine compassion and affection and love is like, it's very, very, very good writing. It's a really brilliant moment.
Yeah, it's pointed. It's one of the great things that the portrayal of their relationship contributes to queer culture. And even looking back at Remove of all our experience since, it seems like a genuine kiss. Like, I find that their interactions and like seeing feel like a couple. And even these days, you sometimes see queer couples on TV which don't seem like real people. Yeah.
No, yeah.
But this was genuine. It was, she kisses her out of the need to
comfort. Yeah.
And yeah, it was very effective. And as we have said probably before, but my God, Alison Hannigan can cry.
Yeah. So one of the Buffy bits that people trot out for this episode is that apparently Alison Hannigan, every single shot for that scene that she was doing where she's trying to pick out the top, apparently she managed to put on the waterworks literally every time and had everyone on set crying every single time, which is impressive. And yeah, Alison Hannigan cries and I cry. There's no two ways about it.
Yeah.
You know what I really love about this show is that like I'd say the last 3 times I've watched through this entire show, it's for me all been entirely the Willow show. It's been all about Willow. I've been like, love her so much. She's my favorite character in every way. And this watch through, it's been very much that like Buffy is no doubt my favorite character all the way through. Anyway, so yeah, I think we can kind of move on from the opening act anyway. So from there, Buffy goes to tell Dawn. The Dawn section is really interesting. It's kind of, I think, very much noting the high schoolness of the origins of the show and the kind of the childishness. Yeah, and innocence that the show had at one point, because Dawn is shown, the opening shot is her weeping, and you're like, oh, she's already been told, grand. And she looks kind of pissed off. And you find out that no, just Kevin said she was freaky because she has self-harmed and stuff.
She thinks her life is over because this horrible thing has happened, that a boy has said something real about her.
Yeah.
Which is like, I think quite
it's heartbreaking.
It's cruel, not inappropriately so, but to the viewer it's like, oh, just like, again, that feeling of she has such little time until her life changes.
Yeah, it's so true. And then basically she's in our class and she's doing normal child things while her friend is writing notes behind her back to show her while she's talking to the boy who she's really fancies, and the boy is like, oh, you're really interesting, and she's doing a drawing. And then like, yeah, there's like the moment where she sees Buffy, you can feel the like aggressive interruption into her life.
Yeah, where she literally walks directly into her class and it's like, I need to talk to you now.
Yeah. I actually missed it this time, but I think there is a moment there, isn't there, where like you can see Buffy talking to the teacher first, or do you just see Buffy there? Does she just kind of?
I didn't pick up on it, but by the lack of reaction from the teacher, I have to assume that she said, I need to speak to Dawn or something.
Yeah. Like no, when the teacher is looking at Dawn at that point, you can see that she knows what's happened already.
Also, can we say that it's a tremendous conceit, and I kind of love it that it's obviously some writer room element where it's like, okay, so obviously Buffy's going to take her outside, could tell her, but we want to have this element of her being exposed and of people seeing her when she finds out and all that kind of stuff. So in this art room, the entire classroom is surrounded by glass walls.
I have a lot to say about that.
Yeah, okay.
So it's fresh.
Do you have something to say about what she's drawing as well?
Yeah.
Okay, good, because I was like, I felt real clever when I was like,
negative space
and a body. Yeah,
and a body.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, so so Buffy takes her out of the classroom to. You're okay? You said that I got that as well.
No, I presumed you had it. So I just want to make certain.
Okay, so she takes her out of the classroom, and in a very, very good writing moment, you don't actually hear what Buffy says to Dawn. You hear the beginning of the conversation of Buffy saying mom's had an accident, then she kind of goes to correct herself. No, and you can hear Dawn saying, you're lying. But basically you're a witness to this moment, because there's no real. It's very much a lost in translation kind of moment, except that the script has been released, so you can see exactly what Buffy says. But it feels that emotional distance is important because it's not something that you're experiencing. It's something you're experiencing with these characters. Anyway, and just the moment where Dawn just entirely collapses and falls to the floor, I couldn't deal. I was like, that is anyway, it was very upsetting, I thought.
Yeah.
But it's go on.
It's something that I kind of appropriately, I find difficult to articulate, but I find very not relatable, but very potent and very important about this kind of stuff. And it's something which is common in a lot of grief structures, and a lot of, particularly, I think, like Irish history with grief, and the concept of kind of, without being too begorra about it. But honestly, like the idea of banshees and keening and the wailing and the wake and all that kind of stuff, which is very much at the heart of, I think, our interpretation of that, which isn't necessarily at the heart of all current approaches to death, and it's this rending and this wailing and this sense of that the parameters, the borders of her existence have been dissolved. And there being no way to contain it. Is so evocative and so essential. You can't just have her be a bit sad, it has to be everything is over.
Absolutely. And they do a very similar thing in this for Dawn there, where like the photography and the approach to the episode to this point in the section for Dawn, where she's been interacting with her fellow students, and she's been like having a boy problem to some degree. It's shot very normal. It feels like comforting and
an oasis.
And then when Buffy approaches her, the camera immediately takes on Dawn's perspective to some degree, because it's a flash of the teacher's face, it's a flash of the statue, the Greek statue they're drawing, and then a hand going across the easel, and then Buffy's telling her, and the photography is immediately like distancing and disassociating and impossible. And it's just like that breakdown of structure in the face of grief even is very upsetting.
Yeah, and let's give a participation ribbon as well to the conversation she's having with her classmate, which is like, yeah, I get why you hurt yourself. Sometimes I feel pain. And she's like, yeah, a lot of people don't get that. Pain. It's something I feel, and it's really cool that you know what pain is as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's awful. So one of the things that Rhonda Wilcox notes about this episode is, she focuses on two specific themes throughout the episode, or thematic imagery components. One of them is threshold imagery. I think there are a bunch of different things there. So you get in the, you have things like Buffy nearly going past the threshold out of her house into the world to see if she can find help, and realizing that on some level she can't find help with Joyce, because there's no help to be had there. It's also very important to note that the ultimate threshold is life into death. So that's going to be the pervading understanding of what a threshold represents in this episode. On the stairs, there's a bunch of photos really specifically highlighted in this episode of more threshold images. You see Buffy going to the back door trying to find life again, and again she can't escape, and she's restrained from exiting, and it's very good, very interesting image. And then when you have at the end of that first section, Buffy leaves the door open when the EMTs have left. I think that's a very important image, because thresholds in this show very specifically I'm not sure if threshold is a word that people use often, but the threshold is basically the area of a door that you step over to get into the next room, essentially.
I think this might be a consequence of us being too not being able to
tell what's
see
actually
the shore anymore. I think threshold is actually probably quite common word.
Yeah, but I think people, if they know what the physical threshold is, they might not know what the image or the metaphorical threshold is.
Yeah, absolutely.
So and it represents kind of like the change of one state into another, from one space into another. In common understanding of image, of symbolism, very important to note there as well. Symbolism, whatever kind of associations you have with a symbol, or whatever kind of associations a symbol might come to have in a text, there's no book out there that says here's what symbols mean.
Yeah,
I always thought there was when I was younger. I was like, whenever our teacher would be like, this sibilance represents the sibilance being repetition of S sounds. Represents the silkiness of the water and the movement of the boa. No,
like you could be a necromancer and be like, this symbol means this summoning sign.
100%. Symbolism is a pure association. There's no hard coded symbolism in the world.
As one of my teachers used to say, it's all just a lot of symbolics.
It's true. That's really good.
Take that one to the bank.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So threshold imagery. And then, so Buffy leaves the door open when the EMTs leave, and Giles comes in through it. But I think Buffy the Vampire Slayer leaving her door open in a situation where the door comes to represent kind of like the thing keeping the monsters at bay, the space at which the vampires can't cross over.
The wafer thin membrane between her and what she isn't. Yeah.
Exactly. It's just so vulnerable and so forgetting who you are because in the face of that. Plenty of other threshold imagery. In this scene specifically, you get that kind of like that impermeable barrier between Dawn and her schoolmates, where they can see into what Dawn's experiencing through the glass windows in that room, but they can't access it. There's no moving of empathy through that, and it's the same thing for the viewers. You can't inhabit that role with them because it's impossible. And
probably one of the most provocative uses of that kind of threshold imagery and that kind of impermeable sense of barrier is in Sarah Michelle Gellar's kiss on social media.
Yeah, we were watching this last night. There's a video for MTV something or another, and it's Selma Blair and Sarah Michelle Gellar going to lean in to replicate the kiss from Cruel Intentions, and they fall up against a big
perspex like barrier basically.
Yeah, and they just kiss the barrier for a bit, and they're like, "Oh, 2020 was shit."
I think she looks wonderful. She honestly looks wonderful.
Selma Blair looks wonderful too, and has become like such an important spokesperson for multiple sclerosis. So anyway, but I
couldn't parse that for a second. I was like, you mean she's being a spokesperson for many different scleroses? And I was like, no, MS is actually a thing. But
it really is. And I've been watching so much The West Wing, so and also my aunt has MS. Anyway, but the other threshold imagery that I think is less interesting would be things like when you have the camera floating into the dorm room. When Willow and Tara are talking, and then out again when they leave the dorm room. It's very interesting threshold image. Very interesting though is Buffy, or when Dawn locks the door into the morgue, and Buffy has to break through it, kind of very much visually breaking down the barrier that stands between Dawn and death because she needs to save her. And I think very much replicating the symbolic position that Buffy finds herself in at the end of the season, where she has to cross the threshold from life into death to save Dawn's life. So good stuff there. But the other one that Rhonda Wilcox highlights as an image is just bodies physically through the episode. So this scene with the art class is very much representative of that, because the art teacher was specifically cast, the actress there, to look like Christine Sutherland.
I have a feel. Yeah, I did get a sense of that.
Yeah. So she's specifically cast because she does look a bit like her. She looks like a vague memory of Christine Sutherland, and it's kind of comforting, but kind of awful. Yeah, and then they're painting the negative space outside of a Greek statue of a woman. Greek statues of women, like, cold, lifeless, marble, and frozen forever in a moment of beauty or sadness,
perception.
But that's, and perception 100%, and that's what all they have left of Joyce is the negative space outside of that her body is created. Basically, there's no internalizing of her internal life of her anymore. So that kind of negative space around Joyce is where the whole episode of the body exists in. So them really thematically and verbally confirming this importance of the negative space there is very interesting.
Yeah, it's really one of these things where it's like, this is what the episode was about. It's not a secret, it's about the absence.
100%, and I think that's really good writing. So yeah, and then the charcoal drawing of the body is like, again, what you're left with is it's the impression of this thing onto a piece of paper that is now gone. Essentially, it's very, very upsetting. And then obviously, you have that woman who's like, body physically is like, replicating of Joyce's body, and that's kind of might be what you see in the world after someone's died, is like, echoes of them. And and then like you have Joyce's body being physically represented so consistently through the episode, and then invaded at the end, where you can see that she's had an autopsy done, and her part of her skull has been removed to some degree, which is just horrifying. And it kind of it really resonates why you have I don't know, it's bad. And bad. Then you have Xander and Dawn's self-harm being an element in this episode. So Xander punches through a wall, and Willow asks, did it help? And he says for a whole set. But she's like, was it a whole second that it felt better for, essentially. And then Dawn's self-harm being an issue in school, where it's that stigma of kind of like invading your own body. So physical bodies very much at play here in terms of the thematic soup.
Absolutely. And I'd say that Dawn's reaction or her emotionality in this episode is probably something which gives people ammunition to be like, oh, she's so like difficult. But again, I feel like she reacts like, even in both her high school behavior and her like grieving behavior, like she acts fairly normal, I think. Yeah,
I think so too.
I didn't find any of it grating. Yeah,
me neither at all. I feel like I've talked a lot. Well, that's how it's going to go for now.
Brian just described the podcast.
So one of the things I wanted to talk about was this episode as like quality TV. So I think a lot of people over the years have highlighted this episode specifically as like, you know, oh, this is the really good episode of Buffy because it's like structurally unusual. It has a lot of realism to it. And people have talked a lot about, and Ronan Wilcox talks about this, about how people have discussed this episode and said it's a shame about the vampire interruption.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. Which
I personally hugely disagree with.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I think the vampire interruption represents a lot of things. It represents like, you know, the interruption of life. Like, I mean, Buffy can't stop being the Vampire Slayer. She doesn't have no responsibilities now. She has to still deal with this.
There's a perception, an offhand perception that there had to be some supernatural element included, or else, I don't know, like the writers wouldn't allow it, the network wouldn't allow it. But I think, as I'm sure you're about to say, that having going back to a vampire, having a vampire in this last scene where she can do something, kind of brings her back to herself and to her purpose to a certain degree, is something she can do, but it won't help the problem she has. And killing particularly a naked male vampire with an autopsy saw inches from her mother's body, like that is like a soup, as you say thematically.
Yeah. Actually, go back to the thresholds very briefly, and vampires though, which is okay. Wilcox says the chapter this is from is called Death. They're going to find a body, quality television, and the supernatural in Buffy. Anyway, so what she says about the kind of vampires and threshold imagery is the combination of images of threshold crossing and body wounding should not be surprising in a text that, as a whole, focuses on vampires. Buffy's vampire mythology does follow tradition of the importance of the threshold to vampires. The threshold can, of course, be seen as a sexual threshold. Vampires penetrate the body, and vampires can only cross the threshold to the home representing the body when invited. There is a notable exception. If the person is dead, the vampire needs no invitation. The threshold has already been crossed. The home and body already entered. And with this context, we can move to contemplate the entry of the vampire into the body of the text. Sorry, into the text of the body. The other one. Yeah, and I think it's there's a very interesting. She also says, I'm gonna read a big shtick thing if you wanna stick put there, Joe. She says, consider furthermore the construction of the vampire attack. Dawn, feeling the need to see her mother's body, has sneaked into the morgue alone. She is attacked by another body in the morgue, which has just arisen as a vampire. Buffy breaks down the locked door and fights the vampire to save Dawn. Other than the vampire, then, the three people involved are Buffy, her mother, and her sister, who is often seen as a symbolic daughter for Buffy. Mother, daughter, self. In a sense, then, we see the three aspects of the same being placed against death. The larger patterns live within the realistic presentation. And in spite of the vampire's supernatural nature, the presentation otherwise does continue to be realistic. Instead of the usual genre convention of heroic score music, we hear only the grunts of the struggle between Buffy and her enemy. This scene, like all others in this episode, is as scoreless as most of life, denied the usual emotional cues of music. The hero's opponent is not dashing. This vampire lives in mottled dead flesh. Another series anomaly, the vampire's nakedness, continuing the motif of the failure to clothe death, reasserts the physicality of death. Whedon says, here's young Dawn confronted by not only a vampire but a naked man. It's an intrusion, it's offensive, it's completely physical. In the body shot at the beginning of Act 4, we have seen from her bare shoulders that Joyce too is naked under the sheet before the Doctor covers her entirely. In the confrontation with the vampire, the covering sheet is drawn from the body, from the top of Joyce's body. Stephen King says all our fears add up to one great fear of the body under the sheet. It's our body. Joyce's body under the sheet is now as frightening in its own way as that vampire. Mother, daughter, sister live in the same space. Generation and dissolution coexist. The battle against the vampire with the vampire death results in pulling that sheet, the divider, aside. By the encounter with death incarnate as the anonymous vampire, the physical realism of the episode is made contiguous with metaphysical. It is metaphor in an extreme way, as extreme in its way as that of metaphysical poet. John Donne's stiff twin compasses are no more strenuous in their extension, which ignored that nonsense about John Donne. He was a great poet. But yeah, that kind of sums up everything I would hope to be able to express about that kind of interaction. It's terrifying. It's a messy soup of nakedness, death, fear, the intrusion of the self, the disgust of a corpse, and everything. It's really not good.
It's everything about Buffy that Owen, the emo who was obsessed with Emily Dickinson, didn't understand. Yeah.
So true. And then I think the last thing I wanted to talk about for this episode, because as I was saying, I don't think it's an episode that needs rigorous academic critique. I think it's one that really stands for itself. The other big thing I think is the that final closing image. So I made you watch this while we were drunk on like Saturday night.
And you went to such lengths to get it up as well.
Yeah, I did. Where where Dawn, basically after the end of this fight, where Buffy is panting on the floor on her back, trying to get the kind of the will to get up. You have Dawn ask, as Joel just reminded me off mic, what Dawn says is she cold? So having concern with the physical body in this case and what it represents. And Buffy says, it's not her. She's already gone. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's not her. She's gone. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Dawn says, where did she go? And of course, that moment is the ultimate question in this instance is this thing in front of me represents the entirety of warmth I've experienced in life, and it's the foundation which I've created in my life as a child, specifically which Dawn is. I have no understanding of what the world is if it's not through the initial frame of what my mother represents and what protection and framing she gives to my life. So if this thing in front of me is not her, where did she go? What transformation has happened to make this beacon of warmth and motherhood into a body? And that's the entire musing of the episode, and it's very, very disturbing. And what I found very disturbing about it as well is that Buffy sounds so distant in that scene. They didn't mic her up. It feels like their microphone was kind of like at the front of the room, and they only vaguely caught Buffy's responses to her. And then you have Dawn in a moment which very much replicates Angel and Buffy attempting to touch each other at the end of season 2 before he gets sucked into hell. You have Dawn reaching forward to touch her mother's cheek in a moment which again is so metaphorically dense. It so replicates the moment of Adam trying to touch God.
The actual distance is tiny.
Yeah.
But it's a distance that can't be bridge.
It's another threshold.
Yeah, and it stops. The episode cooks out before she actually manages to touch Joyce.
So upsetting. Yeah, and it's a moment of attempting to understand the divine and the ununderstandable, and the episode ends because there's no understanding to be had, and she's going to confirm that the body's cold.
Yeah, and very much echoed in the great scene which we didn't touch on with Anya in the dorm room, where Anya initially seems to be very cavalier demon, not understanding human behaviour, being very blunt about it, and Emma Caulfield has a fantastic depiction of basically saying, Will's like, there's things you can't ask and things you can't do, and she's like, how do I know this? How do I know this? How does everyone know this? What am I meant to do? This isn't fair. And where did she go, essentially? And Willow's like, no one knows. And
she very astute portrayal or explanation of grief as she was drinking fruit punch and she thought Joyce can't drink fruit punch anymore, and it's that kind of blunt childishness that I think grief really represents itself for people. It's just I don't have words or ability to or intelligence to understand this because there's no intelligibility about it.
I think there's a lot in the body which we can and should return to over the coming episodes.
It informs the rest of the show.
Yeah, and the stuff to talk about in terms of which we might get into in terms of next week's episode, just Buffy's interaction with Tara and that exchange about Tara's own mother dying and all that kind of stuff, which I think is quite interesting. But I felt that one of the most memorable and one of the most effective things to take away is in the hospital when Anya says to Buffy, you know, I'm sorry that Joyce is dead. She was nice and now everyone's sad. And Buffy,
everyone's hurt.
Everyone's hurt, yeah. And then Buffy very sincerely is like, thank you.
Yeah.
You know, because that's kind of it, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I remember when my dog was put down in 2009, which is not the same as a person losing their mother. I'm not drawing parallels.
Are you saying it's better or worse?
I didn't say either of those things. It's not the same. I remember one of my friends at the time, who I don't talk to anymore, but whatever, was talking to me afterwards, and he was like, I'm sorry, you know, most dogs are better than most people. And I was like, that like the most comforting thing anyone could have told me at the time, because I was like, yeah, it's true. Yeah, thanks. And it was like, acknowledging of the loss. And I was like, oh, anyway, that is the worst thing I'll ever say on this podcast.
Worst thing we won't ever edit anyway.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a lot of it. I'm exhausted. I was exhausted like going into this episode. I'm more exhausted now.
Like, we were so prepared for it, and I was honestly like, I was doing that thing where sometimes when I get upset over things, it's like, oh, that's emotional, and sometimes it's like I'm very kind of picturesque or photogenic kind of tears at this, and sometimes I have to do a big and hold my breath, because if I let anything out, I will just rack. And there was some stuff in this that really made me feel like, oh, cannot look, cannot feel.
Yeah, exactly.
And so yeah, it was draining. So I think there's probably little to talk to in this episode in terms of what was everyone wearing, etc. Yeah.
And yet, so Buffy Bits for you, Joel.
Dust me.
Okay, so this is the only episode without a previously on section of the episode. Apparently, Christine Sutherland was told that she basically told. What I heard was that she told Whedon that she wanted to leave, basically to go traveling Europe, and that's why she's not present for much of season 4. And he said, "Well, you can't leave because I want to kill you off," basically. So that's fine. Apparently, to get the kiss aired, the WB did like have some like pushback, and Whedon threatened to walk from the show to get it aired, which is good. Kirsty, the character of Kirsty, who's the mega skank. No, it wasn't a mega skank. It was a primo biatch.
This is a quote.
Is an actor called Kelly Garner, who I quite like, who was in Lars and the Real Girl. Did I make you watch that?
I think I have seen that, yeah.
Yeah, it's with Ryan Gosling. And another movie I quite like called Thumbsucker. And she was also in Bully, which is an episode that no one should watch. Anyway, there's no Spike in this episode, even though he's credited.
Episode?
Or movie.
Okay.
Yeah. Bully is a movie that no one should watch. There's no Spike in this episode, though he's credited in the opening credits. So apparently, Alison Hannigan had a reaction to the dust from the plaster. What do they call it in America? Drywall.
Drywall. Yeah.
We call it plaster something. Plasterboard. So she has a reaction to the drywall in real life, which is why you can only see her left eye in a lot of the shots after he punches it.
This is when Xander puts his fist through the wall.
Yeah, because one of her eyes swelled up like crazy, and she had to go to the doctor or the hospital the next day, which is not great. And my last little Buffy bit is that apparently the kissing scene. So it was featured in a scene where Rain, who is a lesbian werewolf. Actually, is she lesbian in? I can't remember if it's her or Danny. I know Danny.
What program is this? Sorry, True Blood?
The TV show, the movie New Mutants, the recent one.
Oh, okay.
Hey, where the character Rain she's watching that specifically kissing scene in the movie The New Mutants. So that's interesting. Do you have any Buffy bits, Joel?
No. I experienced this like a newborn.
Fair. Do you have any fashion notes?
No, the only thing I would note in terms of fashion is that Willow kind of hangs the lampshade in the fact that she doesn't really have, all her clothes have like weird patterns on them and stuff. And I don't know what is going on with how Xander's dressing himself at the moment, but it's just corduroy.
He looks like Scooby-Doo. What's his name?
Shaggy.
He looks like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo. Yeah.
No, that's all I took away. And then I suppose that in terms of fashion, just a slightly morbid note, but like Buffy trying to like adjust Joyce's dress so she looks more appropriate, more mom-like, for when the EMTs arrive.
Coming, yeah, because she's worried that her dress is ridden up when she was trying to give CPR, and so she pulls her skirt down so to protect her mother's
modesty,
no longer existing modesty. It's very upsetting. So I think Willow is definitely the fashion nexus of this episode. She has a Powerpuff Girl t-shirt in her, or top in her wardrobe, which I appreciate. She keeps changing her top, so she wants to find the blue one, which Anya does find and doesn't realize that Willow's looking for it. But she can't find it, so she keeps trying on different things. What's really funny about that is that she's wearing a very long denim skirt, and that's definitely what she should have changed instead of her top, because the denim skirt is awful. Willow, she's also wearing some Doc Martens, which I thought was very nice. But yeah, a couple of the different tops she wears are crazy. She goes to wear a purple top at one point and then says, "Wait, what does purple mean?" And Tara says purple means royal, I think. And she's like, "I can't go to the morgue to see Buffy acting all royal,
like a king."
And it's very well written. It's very well done. And I think the other important fashion note is Buffy's red top. I think existing with, red being the most metaphorical, soupy color. It represents life, and representing blood. It represents death. It represents sin. It represents sex. So it's a very confused color, and it looks sad and limp on her and confused, Okay. And then we move on to death count. It's very simple, straightforward.
Yeah, just the naked vampire.
Yeah, absolutely. And
who has absolutely no genitalia to speak of.
Yes, he sure doesn't. And okay, rating. Joel, do you have a rating for this episode?
10 out of 10 groundbreaking gay kisses.
Yeah, tell me about it.
And that's just what we did for the last however. I think that this episode is important for art.
I think so too.
I think it's important for... I think it is a linchpin in the idea that through fantasy and unrealistic imaginative settings we can say things which speak to the core of who we are. I think it is as effective and as worthwhile and as powerful now as it was when it aired, and I think it always will be.
I agree. I think it's 10 out of 10 prima piachas for me.
Not mega skanks, which apparently you pulled out of your own mind.
Did I say mega skank?
You said mega skank initially.
I think they said mega skank in another one.
Okay.
I was gonna say naughty booze hound maybe, but anyway. So prima piachas out of 10. Yeah, it's my favorite episode of TV, I would say. It's moving and upsetting and direct and incredibly tight, incredibly well written, and could only come from this show. And I think it's not an example of the height of Buffy, it's an example of what is at the core of Buffy and everything, just more exposed than usual. And it's for me, it's very important because it's, it's not, if I think that vampire intrusion is very important because it doesn't forget that it's Buffy the Vampire Slayer and it's the Hellmouth. And this isn't trying to be, it's not trying to be The Sopranos, or it's not trying to be, very intense, very high quality show. It's trying to be an expression of something within Buffy. So yeah, it never forgets its, TV format and its serial format, and it leans on that to contribute, I would say, one of media's most upsetting deaths in any property. Because I think TV is the only medium that really stands to communicate death in this way, because you don't really get to know characters in other mediums.
People week on week and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, but characters week on week, they grow slowly and surely. This is the Joyce who told Buffy to get out of her house basically after Buffy kind of came out to her. And you get to this point where she has been a complex character. She's been a comedic character. She's been a very sad character. You've seen her struggle with, the loss of her marriage, and then the lack of control of her child, and the like, you know, potentially, you know, dating again. And this episode where she feels like, oh, you know, maybe things are looking up for Joyce. She's, you know, met this nice guy with a great name. Yeah, and it doesn't work out for her. I think one of the saddest things about this episode, and it's really built into the core, is that we end up not talking about Joyce much as a person because she's gone.
Yeah.
Anyway,
for anyone who's watched this episode for the first time in the pursuit of this podcast,
sorry,
you're here with us now.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, should we just knock Cordelia Chase out of the park? Just get it done quickly. Just fuck it.
I really don't like working with you, I have to say.
I don't care.
No, we will give Cordelia Chase the time it deserves, because it's a very good episode of Angel this week over on the Cordelia Chase. It's called Epiphany. Mm-hmm. It's the resolution or the climax,
conclusion,
so to speak, of the Dark Angel arc, or which I'm kind of like pejoratively calling it, but no, essentially him reaching his lowest point in his kind of journey up until now, and trying to understand what he's all about. He slept with Darla. The presentation implies that this will cause him to lose his soul, but as Angel knows, and as I know, and no one else in the show knows, it's not sex that makes him lose his soul. It's, you know, actual happiness and contentment. So he absolutely dunks on Darla by, you know, she's like, you know, he goes outside and has what is apparently like a fit of heartburn, that's meant to resemble him losing his soul. And she's like, I thought, you know, one perfect moment was all it took. And he's like, it was a perfect moment, Darla, a perfect moment of despair. I'm so sorry. And she, for better for worse, the way she holds herself, and she says, you know, was it not good, etc., is meant to echo.
She says, you know, was it not good, which is literally what Buffy says. Yeah,
but then she says, wait a second, I know it was perfect. You know, I used to do this professionally, etc. So it's contrast and counterpoint there. But
unfortunately, the contrast there is that, like, you know, Darla more represents the sex worker who Angel kills immediately after becoming angelus in season 2 of Buffy. And there are inappropriate connections being drawn there between, or not connections, contrasts being drawn there between sex workers and virgins, you know, or as worse writing would put it, you know, kind of the virgin whore kind of dynamic, you know.
Yeah, I think that is definitely the literary trope that has been drawn on here. Although I will say, in its credit, I don't think it makes a lot of intentionally like offensive references to that or anything like that. It's there in the assumption, the contrast, and the counterpoint. So with that revelation, he comes to understand something which is quite core to the show, and which kind of carries through the rest of this episode, Epiphany, and the epiphany being that you know, he's been working for so long for redemption, for a single moment, a big wing, an end to his struggle. And as he articulates to Kate at the end of the episode, and what becomes the driving force of Angel, the show, is that he realized that there's no big ending coming, there's no big battle to be won really, and that it will always be ongoing, and that if what we do doesn't matter in the grand scheme, then all that matters is what we do, and that each individual act of kindness is the greatest thing he can do. Which
is, you know, one of the classic existential responses. You know, you get to the moment of having no basis on which to create your philosophy. So, you know, deciding to create something through that kind of Kierkegaardian leap of faith is one of the classic responses to an existential crisis, which is what's happened to Angel here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so through the episode, it's him expounding on that and kind of putting that into practice. He recalls, like, oh fuck, I had a suicide call from Kate, I should go and do something like that. Bursts into her apartment, saves her, and all that kind of stuff. Which draws parallels to him trying to get into her father's apartment, not being able to save him, etc. And what one of the points she draws attention, and this is really the end of Kate's arc on the show. One of the things she draws attention to at the end is that, you know, there might be something to his idea that he's here to do something to help people in this way. And he's like, why is that? And she's like, because I never invited you into the apartment. Yeah. So something up there, the powers that be are like saying this is kind of what you should be doing, etc., allowing him in past the threshold. And then otherwise, he goes to rejoin and support the reformed Angel Investigations,
who he now wants to work for rather than them work for him.
Yeah, he basically says that they're not ready to go back to work with him. He's like, I'll work for you because I feel like I still have good to do. And there's just a lot of decent comedy and a decent portrayal around that. And
a return to good dynamics between the characters, like genuinely, like, you know, lighthearted. Well, not lighthearted necessarily, but like charismatic interaction between the players involved.
Yeah, there's a lot of Angel trying to make banter because he feels embarrassed, and he's like, "Oh, you got a gut wound. I actually got a gut wound recently as well. It was an antique sword." Yeah, and just not being able to be social in that way. And then the other significant imagery from this episode, also as a sidebar, the case that Angel Investigations were investigating about this young girl who had a third eye in the back of her head. She just gets killed in this episode, and the demons kill her, and that's kind of it. And once again, we have quite a dodgy example of Cordelia being forcibly impregnated by a demon.
Yep.
The second of at least 3 examples over the course of the show, which is perhaps a conversation for another day. But Lindsay pursues him, having found out that he slept with Darla and being jealous about this, and dresses up in his old-timey lumberjack outfit and jumps into his Dust Bowl era car to run him down and tries to beat Angel to death with a sledgehammer. And one of the strong images being that when Angel quickly kind of overpowers him, he smashes his prosthetic hand with the sledgehammer, and then he's like, could have been the other one. Luckily, I've had an epiphany. And throughout the whole episode, he says epiphany about 100 times, and then Kate references this at the end. He's like, yeah, I keep saying that, no one's listening to me. So I enjoy this episode. I would give this 8 fail feminist gestures, I think.
8,
yeah.
Yeah, me too.
It's a strong episode in a lot of ways for what it's trying to do. And it also thematically, I think, crystallizes what Angel as a show is doing, which is different from Buffy.
I agree, and I think that some of the interactions were there, which was good for me.
So I think we'll draw it to a close. Zip up the body, as it were. So that's it.
I think we have it all in the body bag now.
We do. So that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for sticking with us through this very special, extra long bumper bonanza episode.
It's only about an hour and 10 minutes so far. We're not too bad.
We hope you enjoyed it. We hope you're well. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know. Tell your friends. Call your mom or your dad or your guardian. It's probably been a while. And we will see you next time on Buffy Boys.
Buffy Boys. Huh.